Number 5. The Antonine Plague. Sometimes referred to as the Plague of Galen, erupted in 165 CE, at the height of Roman power throughout the Mediterranean world during the reign of the last of the 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, 161–180 CE. The first phase of the outbreak would last until 180 CE, affecting the entirety of the Roman Empire, while a second outbreak occurred in 251–266 CE, compounding the effects of the earlier outbreak. It has been suggested by some historians that the plague represents a useful starting point for understanding the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire in the West, but also the underpinning to its ultimate fall. Galen, 129 to circa 216 CE, a Greek physician and author of Methodus Medendi, not only witnessed the outbreak but described its symptoms and course. Among the more common symptoms were fever, diarrhea, vomiting, thirstiness, swollen throat, and coughing. More specifically, Galen noted that the diarrhea appeared blackish, which suggested gastrointestinal bleeding. The coughing produced a foul odor on the breath and an exanthema, skin eruptions or rash, over the entirety of the body, distinguished by red and black papules or eruptions. Those infected suffered from the illness for roughly 2 weeks. Not all who caught the disease died, and those who survived developed immunity from further outbreaks. Based on Galen's description, modern researchers have concluded that the disease affecting the empire was most likely smallpox. The epidemic most likely emerged in China shortly before 166 CE, spreading westward along the Silk Road and by trading ships headed for Rome. Sometime between late 165 to early 166 CE, the Roman military came into contact with the disease during the siege of Seleucia, a major city on the Tigris River. Troops returning from the wars in the east spread the disease northward to Gaul and among troops stationed along the Rhine River. 2 different legends arose discussing the exact origins of how the plague was released into the human population. In the first story, the Roman general, and later co-emperor, Lucius Verus opened a closed tomb in Seleucia during the subsequent sacking of the city, thus releasing the disease. The tale suggests that the epidemic was a punishment as the Romans violated an oath to the gods not to pillage the city. In the second story, a Roman soldier opened a golden casket in the temple of Apollo in Babylon, allowing the plague to escape. 2 different 4th century CE sources, Res Gesti by Ammianus Marcellinus, circa 333–91–400 CE, and the biographies of Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, ascribe the outbreak to participating in a sacrilege, violating the sanctuary of a god and breaking the oath. Other Romans blamed Christians for making the gods angry, precipitating the outbreak. There is much ongoing debate amongst scholars regarding the effects and consequences of the epidemic on the Roman Empire. This debate is focused on the methodology used to compute the actual number of people who died. The Roman historian Dio Cassius, 155–235 CE, estimated 2,000 deaths per day in Rome at the height of the outbreak. In the second outbreak, the estimate of the rate of death was much higher, upwards of 5,000 per day. It is most probable that the extreme death toll was due to this disease exposure being new to people living around the Mediterranean. Mortality rises when infectious diseases are introduced into a virgin population, that is, a population which lacks acquired or inherited immunity to a specific disease. All told, it has been suggested that 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population perished, estimated at 60–70 million throughout the empire. What is undisputed is that Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, died from the illness in 169 CE. Marcus Aurelius died 11 years later from the same illness. Ironically, it was Verus' soldiers who contributed to spreading the disease from the Near East to the rest of the empire. At the outbreak of the plague, Rome's military consisted of 28 legions totaling approximately 150,000 men. The legions were well trained, well armed, and well prepared, none of which prevented them from catching the disease, falling ill, and dying. Regardless of their posts, the legionaries contracted the disease from fellow soldiers who had been on leave returning to active duty. The ill and dying caused manpower shortages, especially along the German frontiers, thus weakening the Romans' abilities to defend the empire. The lack of available soldiers caused Marcus Aurelius to recruit any able-bodied man who could fight, freed slaves, Germans, criminals, and gladiators. Depleting the supply of gladiators resulted in fewer games at home, which upset the Roman people who demanded more, not less, entertainment during a time of intense stress. The patchwork army failed in its duty. In 167 CE, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine River for the first time in more than 200 years. The success of the external attacks, especially by the Germans, facilitated the decline of the Roman military, which, along with the economic disruptions, contributed ultimately to the decline and fall of the empire. In more general terms, the horrific death toll reduced the number of taxpayers, recruits for the army, candidates for public office, businessmen, and farmers. At a time of increasing expenses for maintaining the empire and the necessary military forces to ensure the empire's security, government revenues declined. The decrease in tax revenues was attributable to less production on the farms as fewer farmers meant too much land left uncultivated. The scarcity of crops caused steep price increases along with decreasing food supplies. The plague's effect on the economy was not limited to the agricultural sector. Fewer craftsmen meant fewer things being made, which stymied local economies. The shortage of workforce also led to higher wages for those who survived the epidemic, and the lack of businessmen, merchants, traders, and financiers caused profound interruptions in domestic and international trade. All of these downturns meant fewer taxes for the state, which was already sorely pressed to meet its financial obligations. Number 4. The Plague of Justinian. During the reign of the Emperor Justinian I, 527–565 CE, one of the worst outbreaks of the plague took place, claiming the lives of millions of people. The plague arrived in Constantinople in 542 CE, almost a year after the disease first made its appearance in the outer provinces of the empire. The outbreak continued to sweep throughout the Mediterranean world for another 225 years, finally disappearing in 750 CE. Originating in China and northeast India, the plague, Yersinia pestis, was carried to the Great Lakes region of Africa via overland and sea trade routes. The point of origin for Justinian's plague was Egypt. The Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, 500–565 CE, identified the beginning of the plague in Pelusium on the Nile River's northern and eastern shores. According to Wendy Orent, author of Plague, the disease spread in two directions, north to Alexandria and east to Palestine. The means of transmission of the plague was the black rat, Rattus rattus, which traveled on the grain ships and carts sent to Constantinople as tribute. North Africa, in the 8th century CE, was the primary source of grain for the empire, along with a number of different commodities including paper, oil, ivory, and slaves. Stored in vast warehouses, the grain provided a perfect breeding ground for the fleas and rats, crucial to the transmission of plague. William Rosen, in Justinian's Flea, contends that while rats are known to eat just about anything, including vegetable matter and small animals, grain is their favorite meal. Rosen further observes that rats generally do not travel more than 200 meters from their birthplaces over the course of their lifetimes. However, once aboard the grain boats and carts, the rats were carried throughout the empire. According to historian Colin Barras, Procopius recorded the climatic changes taking place in southern Italy during the period, unusual incidents of snow and frost in the midst of summer, below average temperatures, and a decrease of sunshine. So began a decades-long cold snap accompanied by social disruptions, war, and the first recorded outbreak of the plague. The colder-than-usual weather affected crop harvests, leading to food shortages that resulted in the movements of people throughout the region. Accompanying these reluctant migrants were plague-infected, flea-ridden rats. Cold, tired, hungry people on the go, combined with illness and disease in the midst of warfare, as well as an increased rat population carrying a highly infectious disease, created the perfect conditions for an epidemic. And what an epidemic it would be, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, 482–565 CE, Emperorship 527–565 CE, Justinian's plague affected nearly half the population of Europe. Based upon DNA analysis of bones found in graves, the type of plague that struck the Byzantine Empire during the reign of Justinian was bubonic, Yersinia pestis, although it was very probable that the other two types of plague, pneumonic and septicemic, were also present. It was also bubonic plague which would devastate 14th century CE Europe, better known as the Black Death, killing upwards of 50 million people or nearly half the entire population of the continent. Plague was not new to history even in the time of Justinian. Wendy Orent suggests that the first recorded account of bubonic plague is told in the Old Testament in the story of the Philistines who stole the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites and succumbed to swellings. Procopius, in his Secret History, describes victims as suffering from delusions, nightmares, fevers and swellings in the groin, armpits, and behind their ears. Procopius recounts that, while some sufferers lapsed into comas, others became highly delusional. Many victims suffered for days before death, while others died almost immediately after the onset of symptoms. Procopius' description of the disease almost certainly confirms the presence of bubonic plague as the main culprit of the outbreak. He laid blame for the outbreak on the emperor, declaring Justinian to be either a devil or that the emperor was being punished by God for his evil ways. Number 3. The Black Death. The Black Death was a devastating global epidemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost one-third of the continent's population. Even before the death ships pulled into port at Messina, many Europeans had heard rumors about a great pestilence that was carving a deadly path across the trade routes of the Near and Far East. Indeed, in the early 1340s, the disease had struck China, India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. However, Europeans were scarcely equipped for the horrible reality of the Black Death. In men and women alike, the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, at the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits. Waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. Blood and pus seeped out of these strange swellings, which were followed by a host of other unpleasant symptoms, fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains, and then, in short order, death. The Black Death was terrifyingly, indiscriminately contagious. The mere touching of the clothes, wrote Boccaccio, appeared to itself to communicate the malady to the toucher. The disease was also terrifyingly efficient. People who were perfectly healthy when they went to bed at night could be dead by morning. Today, scientists understand that the Black Death, now known as the plague, is spread by a bacillus called Yersinia pestis. The French biologist Alexander Yersin discovered this germ at the end of the 19th century. They know that the bacillus travels from person to person pneumonically, or through the air, as well as through the bite of infected fleas and rats. Both of these pests could be found almost everywhere in medieval Europe, but they were particularly at home aboard ships of all kinds, which is how the deadly plague made its way through one European port city after another. Not long after it struck Messina, the Black Death spread to the port of Marseille in France and the port of Tunis in North Africa. Then it reached Rome and Florence, two cities at the center of an elaborate web of trade routes. By the middle of 1348, the Black Death had struck Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. Today, this grim sequence of events is terrifying but comprehensible. In the middle of the 14th century, however, there seemed to be no rational explanation for it. No one knew exactly how the Black Death was transmitted from one patient to another, and no one knew how to prevent or treat it. According to one doctor, for example, instantaneous death occurs when the aerial spirit escaping from the eyes of the sick man strikes the healthy person standing near and looking at the sick. Physicians relied on crude and unsophisticated techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, practices that were dangerous as well as unsanitary, and superstitious practices such as burning aromatic herbs and bathing in rose water or vinegar. Meanwhile, in a panic, healthy people did all they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused to see patients, priests refused to administer last rites, and shopkeepers closed their stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there they could not escape the disease. It affected cows, sheep, goats, pigs and chickens as well as people. In fact, so many sheep died that one of the consequences of the Black Death was a European wool shortage. And many people, desperate to save themselves, even abandoned their sick and dying loved ones. Thus doing, Boccaccio wrote, each thought to secure immunity for himself. Because they did not understand the biology of the disease, many people believed that the Black Death was a kind of divine punishment, retribution for sins against God such as greed, blasphemy, heresy, fornication and worldliness. By this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. Some people believed that the way to do this was to purge their communities of heretics and other troublemakers, so, for example, many thousands of Jews were massacred in 1348 and 1349. Thousands more fled to the sparsely populated regions of Eastern Europe, where they could be relatively safe from the rampaging mobs in the cities. Some people coped with the terror and uncertainty of the Black Death epidemic by lashing out at their neighbors, others coped by turning inward and fretting about the condition of their own souls. Some upper-class men joined processions of flagellants that traveled from town to town and engaged in public displays of penance and punishment. They would beat themselves and one another with heavy leather straps studded with sharp pieces of metal while the townspeople looked on. For 33.5 days, the flagellants repeated this ritual 3 times a day. Then they would move on to the next town and begin the process over again. Though the flagellant movement did provide some comfort to people who felt powerless in the face of inexplicable tragedy, it soon began to worry the Pope, whose authority the flagellants had begun to usurp. In the face of this papal resistance, the movement disintegrated. The Black Death epidemic had run its course by the early 1350s, but the plague reappeared every few generations for centuries. Modern sanitation and public health practices have greatly mitigated the impact of the disease but have not eliminated it. Number 2. The third cholera pandemic. Though cholera has been around for many centuries, the disease came to prominence in the 19th century, when a lethal outbreak occurred in India. There have since been numerous outbreaks and 7 global pandemics of cholera. Each year, cholera infects 1.3 to 4 million people around the world, killing 21,000 to 143,000 people, according to the World Health Organization, WHO. Cholera is an infectious disease caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. The bacteria typically live in waters that are somewhat salty and warm, such as estuaries and waters along coastal areas. People contract V. cholerae after drinking liquids or eating foods contaminated with the bacteria, such as raw or undercooked shellfish. There are hundreds of strains or serigroups of the cholera bacteria. V. cholerae serigroups 01 and 0139 are the only 2 strains of the bacteria known to cause outbreaks and epidemics. These strains produce the cholera toxin that causes cells lining the intestines to release increased amounts of water, leading to diarrhea and rapid loss of fluids and electrolytes, salts. A single diarrhea episode can cause a 1,000,000-fold increase of bacterial numbers in the environment, according to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. About 80% of people who contract the bacteria don't develop cholera symptoms and the infection resolves on its own. And of the people who do develop cholera, 20% come down with severe symptoms, which include severe diarrhea, vomiting, and leg cramps. These symptoms can cause dehydration, septic shock and even death within a matter of just a few hours. People who contract non-01 or non-1039 V. cholerae can also acquire a diarrheal disease, but it is less severe than actual cholera. Today, cholera is treated through fluid replacement and antibiotics. Cholera vaccines are available, though they only offer roughly 65% immunity, according to WHO. It's unclear when, exactly, cholera first affected people. Early texts from India, by Sushruta Samhita in the 5th century BC, and Greece, Hippocrates in the 4th century BC and Aretius of Cappadocia in the 1st century AD, describe isolated cases of cholera-like illnesses. One of the first detailed accounts of a cholera epidemic comes from Gaspar Correa, Portuguese historian and author of Legendary India, who described an outbreak in the spring of 1543 of a disease in the Ganges Delta, which is located in the South Asia area of Bangladesh and India. The local people called the disease Morixi, and it reportedly killed victims within 8 hours of developing symptoms and had a fatality rate so high that locals struggled to bury all the dead. Numerous reports of cholera manifestations along the west coast of India by Portuguese, Dutch, French and British observers followed throughout the next few centuries. Number 1. The flu pandemic. The influenza pandemic or the flu of 1918 to 1919 killed more people than the Great War, known today as World War I, at somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. It has been cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded world history. More people died of influenza in a single year than in 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351. Known as Spanish flu or la gripe, the influenza of 1918 to 1919 was a global disaster. In the fall of 1918 the Great War in Europe was winding down and peace was on the horizon. The Americans had joined in the fight, bringing the Allies closer to victory against the Germans. Deep within the trenches these men lived through some of the most brutal conditions of life, which it seemed could not be any worse. Then, in pockets across the globe, something erupted that seemed as benign as the common cold. The influenza of that season, however, was far more than a cold. In the 2 years that this scourge ravaged the earth, a fifth of the world's population was infected. The flu was most deadly for people ages 20 to 40. This pattern of morbidity was unusual for influenza, which is usually a killer of the elderly and young children. It infected 28% of all Americans, TICE. An estimated 675,000 Americans died of influenza during the pandemic, 10 times as many as in the World War. Of the U.S. soldiers who died in Europe, half of them fell to the influenza virus and not to the enemy. Deseret News. An estimated 43,000 servicemen mobilized for World War I died of influenza. Crosby. 1918 would go down as unforgettable year of suffering and death and yet of peace. As noted in the Journal of the American Medical Association final edition of 1918. The effect of the influenza epidemic was so severe that the average lifespan in the U.S. was depressed by 10 years. The influenza virus had a profound virulence, with a mortality rate at 2.5% compared to the previous influenza epidemics, which were less than 0.1%. The death rate for 15 to 34-year-olds of influenza and pneumonia were 20 times higher in 1918 than in previous years. Taubenberger. People were struck with illness on the street and died rapid deaths. One anecdote shared of 1918 was of 4 women playing bridge together late into the night. Overnight, 3 of the women died from influenza. Hogue. Others told stories of people on their way to work suddenly developing the flu and dying within hours. Hennig. One physician writes that patients with seemingly ordinary influenza would rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen, and later when cyanosis appeared in the patients, it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. Grist, 1979. Another physician recalls that the influenza patients died struggling to clear their airways of a blood-tinged froth that sometimes gushed from their nose and mouth. Starr, 1976. The physicians of the time were helpless against this powerful agent of influenza. In 1918 children would skip rope to the rhyme. Crawford. The influenza pandemic circled the globe. Most of humanity felt the effects of this strain of the influenza virus. It spread following the path of its human carriers, along trade routes and shipping lines. Outbreaks swept through North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Brazil and the South Pacific. Taubenberger. In India the mortality rate was extremely high at around 50 deaths from influenza per 1,000 people. Brown. The Great War, with its mass movements of men and armies and aboard ships, probably aided in its rapid diffusion and attack. The origins of the deadly flu disease were unknown but widely speculated upon. Some of the Allies thought of the epidemic as a biological warfare tool of the Germans. Many thought it was a result of the trench warfare, the use of mustard gases and the generated smoke and fumes of the war. A national campaign began using the ready rhetoric of war to fight the new enemy of microscopic proportions. A study attempted to reason why the disease had been so devastating in certain localized regions, looking at the climate, the weather and the racial composition of cities. They found humidity to be linked with more severe epidemics as it fosters the dissemination of the bacteria. Committee on Atmosphere and Man, 1923. Meanwhile the new sciences of the infectious agents and immunology were racing to come up with a vaccine or therapy to stop the epidemics. The origins of this influenza variant is not precisely known. It is thought to have originated in China in a rare genetic shift of the influenza virus. The recombination of its surface proteins created a virus novel to almost everyone and a loss of herd immunity. Recently the virus has been reconstructed from the tissue of a dead soldier and is now being genetically characterized. The name of Spanish flu came from the early affliction and large mortalities in Spain, BMJ, October 19, 1918, where it allegedly killed 8 million in May, BMJ, July 13, 1918. However, a first wave of influenza appeared early in the spring of 1918 in Kansas and in military camps throughout the U.S. Few noticed the epidemic in the midst of the war. Wilson had just given his 14-point address. There was virtually no response or acknowledgement to the epidemics in March and April in the military camps. It was unfortunate that no steps were taken to prepare for the usual recrudescence of the virulent influenza strain in the winter. The lack of action was later criticized when the epidemic could not be ignored in the winter of 1918, BMJ, 1918. These first epidemics at training camps were a sign of what was coming in greater magnitude in the fall and winter of 1918 to the entire world. The war brought the virus back into the U.S. for the second wave of the epidemic. It first arrived in Boston in September of 1918 through the port busy with war shipments of machinery and supplies. The war also enabled the virus to spread and diffuse. Men across the nation were mobilizing to join the military and the cause. As they came together, they brought the virus with them into those they contacted. The virus killed almost 200,000 in October of 1918 alone. In November 11 of 1918 the end of the war enabled a resurgence. As people celebrated Armistice Day with parades and large parties, a complete disaster from the public health standpoint, a rebirth of the epidemic occurred in some cities. The flu that winter was beyond imagination as millions were infected and thousands died. Just as the war had affected the course of influenza, influenza affected the war. Entire fleets were ill with the disease and men on the front were too sick to fight. The flu was devastating to both sides, killing more men than their own weapons could. Photo. With the military patients coming home from the war with battle wounds and mustard gas burns, hospital facilities and staff were taxed to the limit. This created a shortage of physicians, especially in the civilian sector as many had been lost for service with the military. Since the medical practitioners were away with the troops, only the medical students were left to care for the sick. Third and fourth year classes were closed and the students assigned jobs as interns or nurses. Star, 1976. One article noted that depletion has been carried to such an extent that the practitioners are brought very near the breaking point. BMJ, November 2, 1918. The shortage was further confounded by the added loss of physicians to the epidemic. In the U.S., the Red Cross had to recruit more volunteers to contribute to the new cause at home of fighting the influenza epidemic. To respond with the fullest utilization of nurses, volunteers and medical supplies, the Red Cross created a National Committee on Influenza. It was involved in both military and civilian sectors to mobilize all forces to fight Spanish influenza. Crosby, 1989. In some areas of the U.S., The nursing shortage was so acute that the Red Cross had to ask local businesses to allow workers to have the day off if they volunteer in the hospitals at night. Deseret News. Emergency hospitals were created to take in the patients from the U.S. and those arriving sick from overseas. The pandemic affected everyone. With 1/4 of the U.S. and 1/5 of the world infected with the influenza, it was impossible to escape from the illness. Even President Woodrow Wilson suffered from the flu in early 1919 while negotiating the crucial Treaty of Versailles to end the World War, TICE. Those who were lucky enough to avoid infection had to deal with the public health ordinances to restrain the spread of the disease. The public health departments distributed gauze masks to be worn in public. Stores could not hold sales, funerals were limited to 15 minutes. Some towns required a signed certificate to enter and railroads would not accept passengers without them. Those who ignored the flu ordinances had to pay steep fines enforced by extra officers. Deseret News. Bodies piled up as the massive deaths of the epidemic ensued. Besides the lack of healthcare workers and medical supplies, there was a shortage of coffins, morticians and gravediggers, knocks. The conditions in 1918 were not so far removed from the Black Death and the era of the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages. In 1918–19 the deadly influenza pandemic erupted during the final stages of World War I. Nations were already attempting to deal with the effects and costs of the war. Propaganda campaigns and war restrictions and rations had been implemented by governments. Nationalism pervaded as people accepted government authority. This allowed the public health departments to easily step in and implement their restrictive measures. The war also gave science greater importance as governments relied on scientists, now armed with the new germ theory and the development of antiseptic surgery, to design vaccines and reduce mortalities of disease and battle wounds. Their new technologies could preserve the men on the front and ultimately save the world. These conditions created by World War I, together with the current social attitudes and ideas, led to the relatively calm response of the public and application of scientific ideas. People allowed for strict measures and loss of freedom during the war as they submitted to the needs of the nation ahead of their personal needs. They had accepted the limitations placed with rationing and drafting. The responses of the public health officials reflected the new allegiance to science and the wartime society. The medical and scientific communities had developed new theories and applied them to prevention, diagnostics and treatment of the influenza